Have you ever looked at someone who seems to live quietly, almost alone, and wondered, how can they be so calm without a circle of friends, without constant social validation? In a world that measures worth by followers, likes, and social gatherings, solitude looks suspicious. But Carl Jung saw something very different. He believed that those who walk alone aren't broken. They're becoming whole. Here's the hidden truth Jung uncovered. People without many friends often share 5 rare psychological traits, not because they've failed at connection, but because they've mastered a different kind of relationship, the one with their own soul. In this video, we'll explore the 5 traits that define people who walk the lonelier road. By the end, you may see solitude not as a curse, but as one of the most powerful teachers life can offer. But before we begin, if you're someone who feels deeply, who often sees through the noise of society and senses there's something more beneath appearances, then you belong here. Subscribe to our channel, Inner Wise Woman, and turn on the notifications. Here we explore Carl Jung's teachings, inner transformation, and the psychology of awakening for women and seekers who crave depth over distraction. Now, let's begin with the first personality trait Jung noticed among those who stand alone. They are authentically independent. Most people crave company not because they love others, but because they fear being alone with themselves. Jung called this fear the shadow of modern life, the anxiety that emerges when the external noise fades and the inner voice begins to speak. But people without many friends, they've already faced that silence. They've met their own mind in its raw form, and what they discovered there made them self-reliant in ways others can't imagine. This independence isn't arrogance, it's inner freedom. These individuals don't need validation because they draw meaning from within. Jung would say they've begun the process of individuation, the sacred journey of separating from collective expectations to discover one's true essence. They move through the world like quiet flames, steady, contained, self-fueled. While others seek mirrors in the eyes of the crowd, these souls have already found one in the depths of their own unconscious. But this independence comes with something deeper still, a second trait that most people misinterpret. It's not just that they don't need others, it's that they're selective, almost intuitively so. And in the next section, we'll explore why their solitude is not rejection of others, but reverence for what's real. Most people think that those who have few friends are cold, distant, or socially awkward. But Jung would say that isn't true at all. The second trait of people who live in solitude is their rare selectiveness, not in a superficial sense, but in a deeply psychological one. They don't avoid people, they avoid shallowness. They have little tolerance for what Jung called collective personas, the masks people wear to survive social life. When you see through those masks, it becomes hard to play along. These individuals crave authenticity like oxygen. They can't fake interest in conversations that circle endlessly around gossip, trends, or appearances. Their energy simply doesn't align with it. So rather than forcing connections that feel empty, they choose quiet. To most of society, this looks like isolation, but Jung understood it as a sign of psychological maturity. It's the moment when a person no longer seeks the crowd's approval because they've begun to listen to the deeper voice of the self. And here's the paradox. The fewer people they allow close, the deeper those relationships tend to be. When they do connect, it's soul to soul, not persona to persona. They aren't looking for people to pass time with. They're looking for resonance, for that rare vibration that feels like truth. Jung once wrote that loneliness doesn't come from having no people around you. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that matter most. For the solitary soul, this is the quiet ache that shapes them. They long to speak about meaning, transformation, dreams, synchronicities, and the patterns behind life, but few can meet them there. So instead, they cultivate a kind of sacred silence, an inner temple where truth can live undisturbed. And in that silence, something extraordinary happens. They begin to discover themselves more fully. Their loneliness becomes the soil of self-knowledge. They start noticing their own emotions, tracking their inner landscape with a clarity that others rarely experience. Jung would say they are listening to the whisper of the unconscious. This brings us to the third trait, one that transforms solitude from emptiness into revelation. Those who have few friends possess an unusual depth of introspection. They don't just think, they observe their thoughts. They don't just feel, they study their feelings. It's this capacity for introspection that turns isolation into insight. And in the next part, we'll see how their solitude becomes the doorway to wisdom, not weakness. When Jung explored the inner world of solitude, he discovered something remarkable. Those who spend long periods alone develop an expanded awareness of their own psyche. They become explorers of the unseen, travelers of their inner terrain. This third trait, deep introspection, is what turns isolation into initiation. Most people run from silence because silence exposes the truth. When you're alone, there's no one left to distract you from yourself. The unhealed wounds, the unfinished stories, the repressed desires, they all rise to the surface. But people with few or no friends have learned to face that rising tide instead of drowning in it. Through solitude, they develop what Jung called inner dialogue with the unconscious. They begin to interpret their dreams, notice synchronicities, and trace patterns in their emotional life. Each insight becomes a message from the deeper self, the eternal aspect of psyche that guides growth and transformation. For them, loneliness is not a void, it's a mirror. They don't just see what's broken, they see what's trying to be born. And here's what's truly profound. This level of introspection often births creativity and originality. Jung observed that solitude activates the imagination because the unconscious finally has space to speak. When the noise of the crowd fades, inspiration flows freely. Writers, artists, thinkers, and mystics often carry this same trait. They live on the edges of society, not because they reject it, but because they see beyond it. Their solitude is the forge where insight takes shape. In Jung's words, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For these individuals, time alone is that privilege. It's where they separate from the expectations of the collective and start hearing the music of their own soul. But introspection doesn't end there. It evolves. The more they understand themselves, the more they begin to understand others, not superficially, but empathetically. Their compassion grows deeper because they've sat with their own pain. That's why Jung believed solitude is often the birthplace of wisdom. It's not the absence of love, but the refinement of it, the transformation of need into understanding. And this depth leads naturally to the fourth trait, a kind of spiritual independence that makes them resilient, peaceful, and strangely luminous. Up next, we'll explore how this spiritual foundation becomes their quiet superpower, the one thing that allows them to walk alone without ever feeling lonely. When Jung wrote about solitude, he often spoke of it as a spiritual necessity, not a social failure. He believed that those who spend long stretches of life alone are being guided by something larger than logic, a calling from the self. This is the fourth trait of people who have few or no friends, spiritual independence. They have learned to draw meaning not from approval, company, or outer success, but from the inner experience of being alive. They've discovered that peace isn't found in other people, it's found in presence. Many of them don't even label this as spirituality. It's simply the deep knowing that there's something vast and intelligent moving beneath ordinary life. They can feel it in synchronicities, in dreams, in the quiet intuition that whispers when they're still enough to hear. Jung believed that when someone begins to live from this center, their life transforms. They stop chasing belonging and begin to embody it. They no longer need constant reassurance because they've learned to anchor in their own essence. This inner anchoring makes them incredibly resilient. While others crumble when left alone, these individuals renew themselves in solitude. They turn inward for guidance, finding strength in reflection instead of distraction. You'll often notice this quiet energy in them, not pride, not aloofness, but a peaceful self-containment. They move slower, listen deeper, and seem to exist just slightly out of sync with the restless rhythm of the world. Jung described this quality as living in alignment with the self. It's a psychological maturity that few reach, where the ego no longer fights for dominance, but cooperates with something wiser inside. Because of this, their solitude stops being loneliness. It becomes communion. Instead of feeling cut off, they feel connected to nature, to symbols, to dreams, to the pulse of existence itself. And yet, this independence isn't isolation. In fact, it's what allows them to love more purely. Because once you no longer need people to fill your emptiness, you can finally meet them without agenda. From this place of wholeness, they become quiet healers in the world, people who radiate steadiness wherever they go. And that brings us to the fifth and final trait, perhaps the most misunderstood of all, the ability to transform loneliness into spiritual evolution. Before we explore that final insight, if these ideas resonate with you, if you see parts of yourself in this reflection, remember to subscribe to Inner Wise Woman. Join our community of thinkers, seekers, and women walking the path of depth, wisdom, and individuation. Because solitude isn't emptiness, it's preparation. The final trait of people who have few or no friends, according to Carl Jung, is perhaps the most beautiful one. They turn loneliness into transformation. For most, loneliness feels like exile, a punishment, a sign that something's wrong. But for these souls, it becomes the path home. Jung understood solitude as the crucible where the ego is dissolved and the self is reborn. It's the place where every mask falls away, and what remains is essence. These individuals begin to experience their aloneness not as isolation, but as initiation. Through the quiet, they come face to face with the vastness within them, the eternal part that never needed validation to exist, and from that encounter, they begin to evolve. Jung called this process individuation, the unfolding of the true self. For many, this begins only after the noise of constant connection fades away. In the stillness of solitude, they finally meet the parts of themselves they once abandoned to fit in. The sensitive child, the creative dreamer, the spiritual seeker, the unguarded heart. They begin to reclaim these fragments one by one until a sense of wholeness returns. And that's the quiet paradox Jung revealed. The person who learns to be alone without fear eventually becomes the person most capable of love. Because real love doesn't come from need, it comes from fullness. As they evolve, they also begin to see the world differently. Time slows. Ordinary moments take on depth. Nature speaks. Synchronicities become their conversations with the divine. They stop chasing meaning and start living it. People often mistake them for loners, but what they really are is whole beings moving through a fragmented world. They no longer depend on outer noise to feel alive. Their life hums from within, quietly and endlessly. If you recognize yourself here, the quiet one, the observer, the deep feeler who doesn't fit easily into groups, know this: you are not behind, you are becoming. As Jung once wrote, solitude is not the absence of company, but the moment when the soul is free to speak. So the next time you feel the ache of loneliness, remember, it's not emptiness calling you, it's depth. It's the whisper of the self saying, "Come home."